Folks, Steve Bannon may be the most dangerous man in America today. And why do I say that? Well, as you can see from this picture, it says greetings from the White House. Normally the person that greets you would be the president, and his picture should be up there. So in effect, this picture is basically making the suggestion that the president, in, if not word, deed, is Steve Bannon. Now, what makes him the most dangerous man in America is the fact that one of the most illiterate men in America is Donald Trump. It was recently revealed in an article done by the New York Times that Mr. Bannon slipped one in on Mr. Trump. And no, it wasn't the ban on Muslims. It obviously was the shakeup of the National Security Council, where Mr. Bannon received a permanent seat and two members who should have had permanent seats were kicked off. That's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the director of the National Intelligence. That brings me to this picture. You see these two gentlemen here? Obviously, one of them is Steve Bannon, and the other one is Reince Priebus. Well, previous to this week, Mr. Bannon was absolutely calling the shots. But now these two guys are going to start butting heads. And the reason that they are going to start butting heads is because of the fact that Donald Trump signed an executive order that he didn't read, one that Steve Bannon slipped past him. And now with all of the blowback and criticism that's occurring, Reince Priebus is starting to feel a little bit more of himself, and with Donald Trump's blessing, because Trump got pissed off, the right to have everything properly reviewed. Now, I'm going to read for you the article from the New York Times, and I'm probably not going to read it in its entirety, but just the parts that are, for the most part, relevant. The article begins with, President Trump loves to set the day's narrative at dawn, but the deeper story of his White House is best told at night. Aides confer in the dark because they cannot figure out how to operate the light switches in the cabinet room. Visitors conclude their meetings and then wander around testing doorknobs until finding one that leads to an exit. In a darkened, mostly empty West Wing, Mr. Trump, provocative chief strategist Stephen K. Bannon finishes another 16-hour day planning new lines of attack. Usually around 6:30 p.m. or sometimes later, Mr. Trump retires upstairs to the residence to recharge, vent, and intermittently use Twitter. With his wife Melania and young son Barron staying in New York, he is almost always by himself, sometimes in the protective presence of his imposing longtime aide and former security chief, Keith Schiller. When Mr. Trump is not watching television in his bathrobe or on his phone reaching out to old campaign hands and advisors, he will sometimes set off to explore the unfamiliar surroundings of his new home. During his first 2 dizzying weeks in office, Mr. Trump, an outsider president working with a surprisingly small crew of no more than a half dozen empowered aides with virtually no familiarity with the workings of the White House or federal government, sent shockwaves at home and overseas with a succession of executive orders designed to fulfill campaign promises and taunt foreign leaders. "We are moving big and we are moving fast," Mr. Bannon said when asked about the upheaval of the first 2 weeks. "We didn't come here to do small things." But one thing that has become apparent to both his allies and his opponents: when it comes to governing, speed does not always guarantee success. The bungled rollout of his executive order barring immigrants from 7 predominantly Muslim countries, a flurry of other miscues and embarrassments, and an approval rating lower than that of any comparable first-term president in the history of polling, have Mr. Trump and his top staff rethinking an improvisational approach to governing that mirrors his chaotic presidential campaign, administrative officials and Trump insiders said. This account of the early days of the Trump White House is based on interviews with dozens of government officials, congressional aides, former staff members, and other observers of the new administration, many of whom requested anonymity. At the center of the story, according to these sources, is a president determined to go big but increasingly frustrated by the efforts of his small team to contain the backlash. "What are we going to do about this?" Mr. Trump pointedly asked an aide last week, a period of turmoil briefly interrupted by the successful rollout of his Supreme Court selection, Judge Neil M. Gorsuch. Chris Rudy, the chief executive of Newsmax Media and an old friend of the president, said, "I think in his mind the success of this is going to be the poll numbers. If they continue to be weak or go lower, then somebody's going to have to bear some responsibility for that. I personally think that they're missing the big picture here," Mr. Rudy said of Mr. Trump's staff. "Now he's so caught up, the administration is so caught up in turmoil, perceived chaos, that the Democrats smell blood, the protesters and the media smell blood as well." One former staff member likened the aggressive approach of the first 2 weeks to D-Day, but said the president's team had stormed the beaches without any plan for a longer war. Clashes among staff are common in the opening days of every administration, but they have seldom been so public and so pronounced this early. This is the president who came to Washington vowing to shake up the administration, and this is what it looks like. It's going to be a little sloppy. There are going to be conflicts, said Ari Fleischer, President George W. Bush's first press secretary. All this is happening as Mr. Trump, a man of flexible ideology but fixed habits, adjusts to a new life, job, and city. Cloistered in the White House, he now has little access to his fans and supporters, an important source of feedback and validation, and feels increasingly pinched by the pressures of the job and the constant presence of protests, one of the reasons he was forced to scrap a planned trip to Milwaukee last week. For a sense of what is happening outside, he watches cable, both day and night, too much in the eyes of some aides, often offering a bitter play-by-play of critics like CNN's Don Lemon. Until the past few days, Mr. Trump was telling his friends and advisors that he believed the opening stages of his presidency were going well. "Did you hear that? This guy thinks it's been terrible," Mr. Trump said mockingly to other aides when one dissenting view was voiced last week during a West Wing meeting. But his opinion has begun to change with a relentless parade of bad headlines. Mr. Trump got away from the White House this weekend for the first time since his inauguration, spending it in Palm Beach, Florida, at his private club, Mar-a-Lago, posting Twitter messages angrily and in personal terms about the federal judge who put a nationwide hold on the travel ban. Mr. Bannon and Reince Priebus, the two clashing power centers, traveled with him. By then, the president, for whom chains of command and policy minutiae rarely meant much, was demanding that Mr. Priebus began to put in effect a much more conventional White House protocol that had been taken for granted in previous administrations. From now on, Mr. Trump would be looped in on the drafting of executive orders much earlier in the process. Another change will be a new set of checks on the previously unfettered power enjoyed by Mr. Bannon and the White House Policy Director, Stephen Miller, who oversees the implementation of the orders and who received the brunt of the internal and public criticism for the rollout of the travel ban. Mr. Priebus has told Mr. Trump and Mr. Bannon that the administration needs to rethink its policy and communications operations in the wake of embarrassing revelations that key details of the orders were withheld from agencies, White House staff, and Republican congressional leaders like Speaker Paul Ryan. Mr. Priebus has also created a 10-point checklist for the release of any new initiatives that include sign-off from the Communications Department and the White House Staff Secretary, Robert Porter, according to several aides familiar with the process. Mr. Priebus bristles at the perception that he occupies a diminished perch in the West Wing pecking order compared with previous chiefs. But for the moment, Mr. Bannon remains the president's dominant advisor, despite Mr. Trump's anger that he was not fully briefed on details of the executive order he signed, giving his chief strategist a seat on the National Security Council, a greater source of frustration to the president than the fallout from the travel ban. It is partial because he is seen as having a clear vision on policy, but it is also because others who have been expected to fill major roles have been less confident in asserting their power. Jared Kushner, Mr. Trump's son-in-law, occupies a central role in the administration and has been present at most major decisions and photo ops. But being the father of young children, he has taken to a life in Washington along with his wife Ivanka, and has already been spotted at various events around town. Because of that, Mr. Bannon has rushed into the vacuum, telling allies that he and Mr. Miller have a brief window in which to push through their vision of Mr. Trump's economic nationalism. Mr. Bannon, whose website Breitbart was a magnet for white nationalists and xenophobic language, has also tried to reassure official Washington that he is being careful and will build bridges with the Republican establishment, especially Mr. Ryan, whom he once described as the enemy and vowed to force out. He now talks regularly with Ryan to coordinate strategy or plot their planned overhaul of the tax code. So that's, and I'm going to leave a link to the article, but pretty much that just tells you that Steve Bannon took advantage of Donald Trump's lack of reading the shit that he signs and signed off on Bannon becoming a member of the National Security Council. And it doesn't surprise me that with Jared Kushner out of the loop, especially on the weekends when he observes the Sabbath and also is with his wife and his children, that these individuals are getting stuff pushed through without any checks and balances. Now I want to see how long Reince Priebus is going to be able to wield any significant power as far as the White House is concerned. But I guess we should be able to see what's going to happen over the next couple of weeks and whether both Priebus and Kushner are successful in reining a bunch of this bullshit in. But as for right now, it's Steve Bannon pretty much calling the shots, along with his white supremacist partner, Stephen Miller. So Donald Trump is a victim of his own ineptitude as far as not reading the stuff that's put in front of him before he signs it.